Good morning and welcome to day 2 of our 2-day workshop. Today is the training on the school plans for student achievement. Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge during this week of the administrator, the dedication and support that each of you give to the students, the staff, and the families at your schools, especially with the federal programs and all the work that you do to keep implement a federal program and have compliance, like attending this 2-day training, we know is ultimately for the students, and we thank you for your time. Just a reminder that this workshop is designed as a trainer of trainers for district or school level staff with responsibilities for support and oversight of the school site council and the development of school plans. Today, we will look in depth at the requirements and the development of the school plan for student achievement. I'm Adrienne Balcazar, and I would like to introduce the LCAP-State and Federal Programs Unit. Joining us today is the whole team, and we have Debbie Cano, and I'm going to let you come off and say hello. Helen Choi.
Good morning.
Laurel Estrada.
Good morning, everybody.
Augustine Garcia.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday.
Rachel Garcia.
Good morning, everyone.
Jeannie Keith.
Hello, everyone.
And Anita Lomali. And I want to also introduce our support staff, Maribel Leva and April Grease.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Great. To access today's presentation, we ask you to click on the link in the chat, and this will take you directly to the slides. But you also can access it if you click the link at the top of this slide, and it will take you to the Canvas page. The presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here, as well as the agenda and resources. As I mentioned last week, if you joined us, you can order a copy of our School Site Council Handbook on our website by following the link at the bottom of the slide. In the handbook, you will receive samples of agendas, bylaws, minutes, and other resources, as well as these topics you see here. Today, you will hear from Rachel, Helen, Anita, Laurel, and myself. As we cover today's agenda, we will talk about addressing all the aspects of school plans and the planning requirements, and including the school site council's role in this process. We'll cover the school-wide program, the SIPSA itself, comprehensive needs assessment, resource inequities, evidence-based interventions, the steps to developing the SIPSA, CSI, TSI, and ATSI in the school plans, as well as the connection between the LCAP federal addendum, and the SIPSA. As usual, please place your questions in the chat box, and we will answer any questions that we can, but we'll follow up with written responses in a Q&A that will be emailed to everyone who is registered, and it will also be posted on our Canvas page. So let's get started. A school-wide program is a comprehensive program intended to improve outcomes for all students in a Title I Part A school. But just to ground us in the Title I program, there are two types of Title I school programs. There is the Targeted Assistance School Program model and the school-wide program model. The Targeted Assistance School Program model is the default program for Title I schools. In the Targeted Assistance School Programs, services are provided to eligible students based on multiple objective, academically related criteria. These services must be supplemental to what is being provided to all students at the school. And all the activities, strategies, and interventions must be evidence-based. The other model is the Title I school-wide program. The purpose of the school-wide program is to improve the academic achievement throughout the school for all students, especially for the lowest achieving students, and is to result from improving the entire educational program at the school. In order to implement a school-wide program at the school site, the school must meet the eligibility requirements. A school is eligible if the school serves a school attendance area in which not less than 40% of the children are from the low-income families, or not less than 40% of the children are enrolled in the school are from low-income families. If a targeted assistance school meets the eligibility criteria, and they can move to a school-wide program. But the following school-wide program requirements and steps must be followed. So we have, for the first year, a year-long planning process. In addition to that, there must be a comprehensive needs assessment, a school-wide plan, an annual evaluation. And we often get questions about schools wanting to go from the targeted assistance program to a school-wide. And so it's important that people understand the reasons and the benefits of why a school would want to go school-wide. So is that the school does not require the identification of individual students for services as required in the targeted assistance model. The individual services do not need to be supplementary as traditionally in Title II or Title III. And the allowability of costs for services is based mainly on the comprehensive needs assessment and what's written in the school plan. So let's take a look at the year-long process. Before this process can begin, it's extremely important, and I can't express enough how important it is that the district must first determine if the school is actually ready to implement a school-wide program. These questions need to be considered before starting the year-long planning process. So you would need to ask, what is the current status of the Title I program? What is the school's understanding of targeted assistance and school-wide? Do they understand the difference? How will a school-wide program improve the academic achievement for those students who are furthest from achieving the standards? And what is the expected outcome? And lastly, how do you determine if the school is ready to upgrade the entire educational program at that school? So we've created a tool, a readiness rubric, that will help the LEA determine if a school is ready to transition to a school-wide program, and to determine what level of support is needed from the district leadership. You can find the handout at the link at the bottom of the page. The LEA can use the readiness rubric to determine where the school currently places on the rubric. The LEA should reflect on these various aspects of the school, such as the leadership. What level of experience does the school leadership have? Then you'll look at the vision and mission of the school and its level of articulation and implementation of that vision and mission. What level of collaboration exists already among the staff at that school? What is the school's level of commitment to equity? How does the school use data to drive instruction? Does the school have a planning process already in place, or does one need to be created or modified? And lastly, differentiation. Is there actual differentiation happening in classroom instruction that meets the needs of all students? So completing the readiness rubric with the school will guide the district in providing any additional support to the school as this year-long process begins. So the second requirement is a comprehensive needs assessment. So once the district determines that the school is ready, then the school will begin the process of the comprehensive needs assessment. And here, the comprehensive needs assessment takes into account the entire school's information on the academic achievement of all students in relation to the state academic standards. And it takes an even deeper look at the needs of the failing or at-risk of failing students. Next is the school-wide plan. So once the comprehensive needs assessment has been completed, the school will now develop a school-wide plan. The school-wide plan will include the comprehensive needs assessment, the plan development input and process, the plan content, which includes strategies, actions, and services. It will also have annual evaluation at the end of the year, as well as the budget. And if you're consolidating this plan with other plans, a list of programs that are being consolidated in this school-wide plan is necessary. When developing the school-wide plan, it's important to remember that there are specific authorized uses of the Title I funds. It's not a pot of money to be used on anything for the school. And again, I'm going to repeat that because oftentimes schools want to go school-wide because they believe that it gives them flexibility in using the money any way they want. And again, it's a Title I program, a school-wide program, and it is not a pot of money. On CD's website, you can find the web page that explains the criteria for an allowable expenditure with Title I funds. And on that, you're going to see 1 through 13. But here on this slide, 1 through 5 is the allowable uses that applies both to targeted assistance school programs as well as a school-wide program. Activities and expenditures must be aligned to the state academic content standards. The activity or expenditure must be evidence-based. It must be reasonable, necessary, and applicable to the program. And it must supplement the funds that would, in the absence of such funds, be made available from state and local sources and not supplant the funds. And lastly, the funds are used during the current or subsequent federal fiscal year. In addition to those first 5 items on the previous slide, this slide applies to schools that have a school-wide program. So items 6 through 10 state how the activities or expenditures must meet an identified need from your comprehensive needs assessment, is included in your school plan. The plan has been approved by your local governing board, and the school site council will be able to annually evaluate and monitor the implementation of these activities stated within the school plan. And lastly, the activity or expenditure has been reviewed, approved, and recommended by the school site council to the local governing board. If your school is a targeted assistance school program, then you will follow numbers 1 through 5, but then also you will follow 11 through 13 as stated in the slide. In a targeted assistance school program, the activities are for specifically identified students based on the multiple educationally related criteria you have determined. The activity or expenditure is included on an ongoing basis, is part of the review of the progress of these specific students, and is included in the revision of your targeted assistance school program. There's also guidance on staff members paid with Title I funds in a targeted assistance program. So regardless if it is a targeted assistance school or a school-wide Title I program, if an expenditure or activity does not meet all of the above rationale, then it is not likely to be an authorized use of the Title I funds. The last requirement for a school-wide program is number 4 here, the annual evaluation. The school site council must annually evaluate the progress of the programs or activities that were stated in the plan towards accomplishing the goals. It must be determined whether the needs of all students have been met by these strategies or activities that were used, especially for those students who had been furthest from achieving standards. And this is required so that the school plan can be revised as necessary based on the results of your evaluation. And now Rachel will go over the school plan for student achievement.
Thank you, Adrienne, and good morning, everyone. So again, in this section, we'll be taking a look at the requirements for school plans. So the spirit and the intent behind the SIPSA is a cycle of continuous improvement. It's an ongoing cyclical process in which schools engage in strategic planning with educational partners based on a comprehensive needs assessment, implement evidence-based interventions, and evaluate outcomes and progress toward goals in an overall effort to improve the educational programs and student achievement at the school. And school-level SIPSA development should also be in alignment with the district-level LCAP process, which will be touched on later in this presentation. So which schools must develop a school plan? So as Adrian mentioned, the Every Student Succeeds Act requires schools receiving Title I funds and operating a school-wide program to develop a school plan. Schools identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI under ESSA are also required to develop and implement a school improvement plan. However, Education Code 64001 allows the SIPSA to serve as the school improvement plan that's required under federal law for schools identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI. Additionally, a local governing board or body of an LEA may require its schools to complete a school plan, even if one is not required. There are a number of legal requirements for school plans at both the state and the federal level. And Assembly Bill 716 revised Education Code to streamline and align state and federal planning processes and codified federal ESSA school planning requirements in Education Code Section 64001. And for your reference, we've included a handout that highlights the alignment of state and federal school planning requirements. And so you can see the link to the handout on the slide. When certifying the CONAP, LEAs must ensure that the SIPSA meets the legal requirements, that the school site council has developed and approved the SIPSA for each school participating in programs funded through the CONAP, and that SIPSAs were developed with the review, certification, and advice of the School English Learner Advisory Committee, or ELAC, if an ELAC is required. Education Code also requires that SIPSAs be reviewed and approved by the governing board or body of the LEA at a regularly scheduled meeting whenever there are material changes. It's important to note that Education Code does not define material changes. This is something that needs to be defined at the local level. Any change in budget and related program services that might raise questions for your educational partners should be considered material. And also, a 10% budget change in a line item is typically used as a rule of thumb for determining what constitutes a material change. So Education Code 64001 specifies that the development of the school plan shall include the administration of a comprehensive needs assessment and the identification of the process for evaluating and monitoring the plan. Since the school site council is responsible for the development of the school plan, the school site council must be involved in the needs assessment and the evaluation and monitoring of the plan. And your school site council meeting minutes should reflect their involvement in both of these components. The required content of school plans must include goals, evidence-based strategies, actions, or services, and proposed expenditures. The SIPSA goals must address the needs of students and student groups based on the findings of the comprehensive needs assessment. And the strategies, actions, and services included in the plan must be evidence-based and aligned to the needs that were determined through the needs assessment process. The SIPSA must also include proposed expenditures to address the findings of the needs assessment. and that includes any resource inequities that were identified through this process. Essentially, everything should align to the comprehensive needs assessment, which is why it's considered the foundation of the school plan. And we'll be taking a deeper look at the comprehensive needs assessment process later in this presentation. The SIPSA is a one-year plan that's intended to be developed by the school site council and approved by the LEA's local governing board or body before or during the school year for which the plan is implemented. Now, statute does not specify a timeline or a deadline for the development and the approval of the SIPSA. This is a local decision based on your local context and needs. However, please keep in mind that for schools identified for CSI, ATSI, and TSI, the CDE has indicated that the expectation is that the school plan is fully developed and approved by the school and the LEA by the first day of the school year, so that students and the school receive a full year of intervention and supports. And so on the slide, we've also included some planning considerations to think about when determining your LEA's SIPSA timeline. So for example, one consideration might be when schools receive information about budgets that will allow them to plan for the proposed expenditures. So although there's no required timeline or deadline, it's really important to remember that you must have an approved plan in place in order to expend Title I funds. And so again, there's no required timeline for the SIPSA development and approval, but here we just wanted to share a sample timeline. And so this sample timeline highlights a spring cycle in which the SIPSA is developed and approved in the spring of the previous year so that the plan is in place and ready to be implemented by the start of the school year. In this sample timeline, you can see that the implementation and monitoring of the current plan begins at the start of the school year and continues throughout the year. And then planning and development of the 2025-26 plan would begin in the winter and spring, with the plan being approved by the school site council and local governing board by June. Many LEAs have shifted to a spring SIPSA cycle to align with their LCAP development process. If your LEA has a fall or a winter SIPSA development cycle, the important thing to remember is that schools must have an approved plan in place in order to spend Title I funds. And another important thing to remember is that if your SIPSAs are developed and approved based on preliminary Title I allocations or budget estimates, which most LEAs do, then your plan will need to be revised to align with the final CONAP allocations, which are typically available in January or February through the winter CONAP release. The CDE has developed optional SIPSA templates that schools may use depending on the school. And there are 4 templates available. One designed to meet school-wide planning requirements, as well as templates available to meet the federal CSI, ATSI, and TSI planning requirements. Now, there is no required template that schools must use for the SIPSA. It is a local decision as to which template you use. Just keep in mind that if you're not using one of the CDE SIPSA templates, you'll need to ensure that the template you are using meets the SIPSA legal requirements. Also, keep in mind that the process of developing the SIPSA is equally important, and a school will need to maintain evidence of this process, and that includes the comprehensive needs assessment, development and approval by the school site council, evidence of input from your ELAC, and the annual evaluation process. And these requirements are also reviewed through the FPM process. Now, the next few slides are only applicable to single school districts and charter schools. So Education Code 64001J allows for single school districts and charter schools to use the LCAP to serve as the SIPSA as long as the plan meets federal school planning requirements and the stakeholder requirements established in Ed Code Section 52062A, and the plan is adopted at a public hearing. So some things to keep in mind when determining whether or not this option would best support your needs are that your Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures would need to be included in the LCAP. Schools would need to demonstrate in the LCAP how Title I funded actions are based on a comprehensive needs assessment to support students furthest away from achieving the standards. And the additional LCAP stakeholder requirements specified in Education Code 52062A would need to be met. So single school districts and charter schools basically have two options. Either combine the LCAP and the SIPSA or keep them as two separate documents. So for option 1, if you choose to use the LCAP as your SIPSA, you would have one plan, the LCAP, which would also serve as your SIPSA. And so for this option, as mentioned, all federal school planning requirements for SIPSAs must be included within the LCAP. So that would include your Title I funded actions and budgeted expenditures. Also, a school site council is not required if using the LCAP as your SIPSA. Instead, you would follow the LCAP consultation requirements. So for charter schools, this includes consulting with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students when developing the LCAP. And the additional stakeholder requirements that are triggered if using the LCAP as your SIPSA are that you would need to establish a parent advisory committee. And the draft LCAP would need to be presented to that committee for review and comment. And a response would need to be provided in writing to the committee's comments. You would also need to establish an English Learner Parent Advisory Committee if you have an enrollment of at least 15% English learners and at least 50 English learners. And your DLAC could serve as your English Learner Parent Advisory Committee. The draft LCAP would also need to be presented to the EL Parent Advisory Committee or DLAC for review and comment. And again, a response would need to be provided in writing to the committee's comments. You would be required to notify the public of the opportunity to submit written comments regarding proposed actions and expenditures in the LCAP. And you would also need to consult with your Special Education Local Plan Area Administrator, or SELPA, in the development of the plan. Next slide. The CDE has developed a number of resources for single school districts and charter schools opting to use the LCAP to meet SIPSA requirements. And so they have a SIPSA LCAP planning summary, also a CSI planning summary, and then a TSI ATSI planning summary. These planning summaries explain how to use the LCAP to meet SIPSA requirements for the school-wide program, CSI, TSI, or ATSI planning requirements as applicable to the school. And the planning summaries provide examples of where in the LCAP the federal requirements may be addressed. With option 2, if you choose not to use your LCAP as your SIPSA, then you would have two separate plans. You would have your LCAP and then your SIPSA. For the development of the LCAP, you would need to consult with the required groups, which again for charter schools includes teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, parents, and students. And with this option, a school site council is required for the development of the SIPSA. So again, for single school districts or charter schools, you have the flexibility to determine which option would best support your site's needs. Okay, in this next section, we'll be taking a closer look at the comprehensive needs assessment process. So what is a comprehensive needs assessment? Well, at its most basic, it's a process or procedure that's used to identify and address factors between current outcomes and desired outcomes. And this process must include steps to provide clarity about the current situation and then identify what's needed to achieve the desired outcomes. It's a systemic process used to identify strengths and weaknesses within the context and constraints of the school and dig deeper into root causes. And root cause analysis is a critical part of the needs assessment process because it addresses the problem rather than the symptoms of the problem. And so the goal of the needs assessment is to help educators identify, understand, and prioritize the needs that a district or school must address in order to improve student outcomes. And this process leads to the development of a plan to improve student outcomes. So it's important to note that a needs assessment is not an isolated tool. It's really the first step in the continuous improvement cycle, which includes understanding root causes that contribute to the prioritized needs, then selecting evidence-based interventions to address those needs, preparing for and implementing those interventions, and then evaluating whether or not the interventions are working in addressing the identified needs. And so the needs assessment is the foundation of the school plan. And all strategies and actions should be informed by and aligned with the data, which will lead to aligned acts of school improvement rather than random acts. So there's not one correct way to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment. And again, it's important to keep in mind that the needs assessment is a process. And so one resource that we'd like to highlight that includes a needs assessment process is the State Support Network Needs Assessment Guidebook, and we've included the link to this resource on the slide. This guidebook supports the development and facilitation of a needs assessment and lays out 5 key phases or steps to support the implementation of a needs assessment. And so these 5 steps include planning, collecting and organizing data, interpreting information, determining priorities, and connecting to implementation. The guidebook includes guiding questions and key considerations for each of the 5 steps. So the first phase or step involves planning the needs assessment. This step lays the groundwork for the rest of the needs assessment process. It involves defining the desired outcomes and then creating a plan to achieve them. And so some of the questions that you would want to consider during this step include, why are we engaging in this needs assessment? Who are the key educational partners? And how will they be engaged in the process and at what points? What will the needs assessment cover? And how will the results of the needs assessment be shared with educational partners? Step 2 is collecting and organizing data. And so data is a foundational component of the needs assessment process. And so as mentioned earlier, the comprehensive needs assessment must include an analysis of verifiable state data, consistent with all state priorities and informed by all indicators, including student performance against state-determined long-term goals. And schools may also include additional data used to measure student outcomes. So this step involves collecting various forms of data and organizing it in a way that is understandable and useful for the educational partners who will be involved in this process. And so some questions that you may want to consider include, what data is readily available from existing sources? What additional data is needed? And what are the best ways to collect this data? And how will the data be presented so that it's clear and understandable for educational partners? The next step is interpreting information. And during this step, educational partners examine data to draw conclusions, identify trends, and begin to identify improvement needs. And so some things that you'll want to consider during this step include, what does the data reveal? What are the strengths and challenges of the current school program? Were there any themes or trends that emerged from the analysis of the data? And how can we articulate what we've learned from the data analysis without casting blame? So through the needs assessment process, it's likely that multiple needs or concerns will emerge. And so this step involves prioritizing those needs so that improvement efforts are directed towards a manageable set of priorities, as well as those that will have the greatest impact for students. And so some questions that you may want to consider during this step include, what findings or themes have emerged that, if addressed, will have the greatest impact on student outcomes? And how many priorities can the school realistically address at one time? And is there any additional data that is needed to make informed decisions about priorities? So the final step of the needs assessment process takes the results and turns those results into something actionable. In this step, educational partners dig deeper to understand root causes of prioritized needs so that they can be connected to the relevant goals. The process of understanding the root causes of prioritized needs also informs the selection of appropriate evidence-based interventions to address those needs. And so some questions you'll want to consider include, what are the potential underlying root causes of the prioritized needs? And how will the school connect the needs assessment results to the selection of evidence-based interventions? So in order to support schools with the needs assessment process, district leaders will need to determine what level of support is needed. And it's very likely that schools will be in different places and need different levels of support. And so here are just a few examples of how districts could support schools with this process. So first, just ensuring that schools understand what the comprehensive needs assessment is and its purpose. Also, training school administrators and school site councils on how to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment. And supporting school administrators and school site councils in understanding the dashboard, data analysis, and how to conduct a root cause analysis. Per the Code of Federal Regulations, schools must document how the needs assessment was conducted, the results it obtained, and the conclusions it drew from those results. And so schools can include a description of their needs assessment process and the results within the SIPSA or in a separate document. If your LEA or school uses the CDE SIPSA templates, it includes a comprehensive needs assessment section to document this process and the results. If your LEA or school uses a locally developed SIPSA template that does not include a section to document the comprehensive needs assessment process and the results, then it will be important that you maintain documentation of this process and your findings. And so as a resource, we've included a comprehensive needs assessment summary tool that could be used to help document this process and the results. And so again, the comprehensive needs assessment is not a thing or a document, but rather a process. So this document or resource, it's not a needs assessment, but rather a tool that you can use to document your process and the findings. Also, for your reference, we've included a link to the CDE's Continuous Improvement Resources webpage, which includes links to several tools and resources to support LEAs in schools with the Comprehensive Needs Assessment. And so that concludes this section, and I will now turn it over to Helen for resource inequities.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, and thank you, Rachel. In this section, we will focus on resource inequities. It's important to remember that every school plays a role in preparing every child for future, regardless of their home life, parental involvement, race, or income level. Identifying resource inequities is a critical part of the comprehensive needs assessment process that Rachel just mentioned, that schools and LEAs must actively engage in. So, Education Code 64001 tells us that every SIPSA shall include proposed expenditures based on projected resource allocation. One crucial part of the SPSA is to address the findings from the Comprehensive Needs Assessment, again, as Rachel just shared, including identifying resource inequities. In other words, schools need to figure out if some students aren't getting the same resources or opportunities as others, and addressing resource inequities is paramount as it serves to guarantee that each student is afforded an equitable opportunity to attain high-quality education. So this is where resource inequities is specified, highlighted in the CDE's SIPSA template. The needs assessment plays a crucial role in identifying these inequities, ensuring that funding and supports are distributed fairly across schools. Schools use this process to align their resources with state priorities, such as improving academic achievement, increasing student engagement, and ensuring access to essential services. By reviewing budget allocations at both the district and school levels, strategies are developed to address the gaps, particularly in underserved communities. This approach, guided by the CDE SIPSA template, promotes equitable resource distribution to meet the needs of all students. So, to address resource inequities, we must first understand what resource equity means. Jonathan Travers, in a working paper published by ERS, highlights that resource equity isn't just about money. It's about how funds, people, and time are allocated and used to create equitable learning experiences for all students. We know that students with greater needs require more resources to achieve the same outcomes. Characteristics like gender or ethnicity should never be barriers to success, and holding lower expectations for any student group is an inequity itself. Any gaps between student groups, whether in dropout rates, attendance, discipline, or achievement, are potential signs of resource inequity. Schools must review these disparities to address the underlying conditions to close equity gaps. So resource inequities in the classroom can significantly affect equity supports provided to students. One key indicator is the use of lower quality books and instructional materials, which can hinder students' ability to access up-to-date and relevant knowledge. In some cases, schools may lack sufficient access to laboratories or rely on outdated computers, limiting students' ability to engage in hands-on learning or develop crucial technological skills. Another sign of inequity is larger classes or having less qualified or experienced teachers, which can diminish the personalized attention and instructional quality that students receive. Additionally, there may be inconsistencies in the application of effective instructional strategies and practices, leaving some students without the tailored support that they need to thrive. Identifying resource inequities is crucial for addressing disparities and ultimately achieving true equity in classroom support. So, how do we do this? On this slide and the tab, you can see that the CDE provides a variety of resources to help support equity efforts. Although the state doesn't prescribe a specific approach for identifying or implementing equity measures, These resources offer valuable guidance. Today, I'll be highlighting the 10 dimensions of equity available on this website, which serves as a framework for fostering more equitable school environments. So from the previous slide, here's the resource from the Alliance for Resource Equity for districts and schools seeking to review potential resource inequities. For those of you who are here today, I'm very confident that you're already familiar with many of these concepts. What we're focusing on now is how to apply these dimensions to identify and address resource inequities effectively. The 10 dimensions of resource equity include school funding, teacher quality and diversity, school leadership and diversity, empowering rigorous content, instructional time and attention, positive and welcoming school climate, student support and interventions, high quality early learning, learning ready facilities, and diverse classrooms, schools and classrooms. These dimensions are interconnected, so concentrating on just one might overlook critical relationships. For instance, enhancing curriculum and teacher training may not yield the desired results if the students don't feel safe and supported. Additionally, some dimensions can conflict. For example, increasing instructional time for math could reduce time for arts and music. Achieving the right balance requires understanding the specific needs of your students, schools, and communities. While no single dimension can solve every challenge, considering them together help create a more equitable and effective educational experience. Evaluating resource inequities also enables us to assess how well our strategies are working and to set clear goals and outcomes for different student groups. And we're going to come back to these dimensions shortly. So the process of identifying resource inequities begins with establishing a dedicated team. It's essential to bring together individuals who are closely involved in the work and can offer valuable insights into potential disparities. And the next step is to analyze the data to identify which dimensions are most affected and how they may interrelate. And meaningful discussions are key to gaining a deeper understanding of the issues pointing to specific resource inequities. And once these have been identified, you can explore evidence-based interventions to address them effectively. So first, prioritize building a team by identifying individuals who are most closely involved in the work, as well as educational partners who can offer objective insights and diverse perspective within your school or district. For example, while teachers are often closest to the day-to-day realities, parents can also offer valuable insights into resource inequities that may otherwise go unnoticed. Think carefully about who these key contributors are and how to involve them in the team. So, at your school or your district, who would be part of this team? Can you share a few ideas in the chat? And please do not include any individual or specific names, but who might that key role be at your school or district? What positions might they hold? So think about it, because this is really essential in building your team. Okay. Thank you. Definitely a PD coach. Some of you guys messaged me. You have your parents, you have your department chairs. That's great. So next, as you delve into data, think carefully about the specific information you need and what you aim to uncover. This isn't just about admiring the data. This is about taking action based on what it tells us. As we review the data on this slide, consider what stands out to you and what questions arise. What additional information might your team need? Are there related data points that could provide further insights? And most importantly, what does the data reveal about the disparities in outcomes? And how can this guide our next steps? So you might be able to use a process like, what do you notice? What do you wonder? and you want to share the data, and part of your team will be able to gather data to make it presentable to a larger group, to the team, to make sure that every data points are addressed and connected. Next, identify which dimensions, remember the 10 that I just mentioned, are most impacted or connected to this area. Collaborate with school teams to reflect on the 10 dimensions, and after engaging in discussion with the team, you can summarize the identified resource inequities in the SPSA or other tools that Rachel shared earlier in the presentation. Keep in mind that a deeper understanding of the school or LEA's context is essential to pinpoint the most affected dimensions. Now let's consider the following scenario, as you will need more context to the data to determine the dimensions. Here is the scenario. Apple Elementary School is a Title I school-wide program school located in a diverse urban area where a significant portion of the fourth grade students come from low-income families. Throughout fourth grade, some students struggle due to limited access to homework, help, and reliable technology. While some students benefit from a wide range of enrichment opportunities, such as online resources and tutoring programs, many low-income students lack these critical supports. Recent budget cuts have eliminated after-school tutoring programs and reduced the number of classroom aides, which previously provided additional academic support. The school uses iReady assessment to measure reading comprehension and writing skills across the grade level. However, low family participation in school surveys and meetings further hinders the school's ability to fully understand and meet the unique needs of these students. Please remember this scenario is in the next few slides, we're going to refer back to this scenario. And I'm sure for some of you, this scenario may closely mirror the current challenges within your own context. So, considering this scenario, take a look at what's highlighted in blue. Which dimension is mostly impacted or connected to this area in blue? Take a look at the dimensions and place your answer in the chat, 1 through 10. The blue says recent budget cuts have eliminated. Which dimension might it be? See a few answers coming in. That's right. Thank you for those who participate. Those of you who participated, that's right. Dimension 1, school funding. Think about this. Does the funding system distribute adequate funding based on student needs and enable flexible use of funds in ways that are clearly understood at your school, at your LEA? So think about this. So we're going to continue with the same scenario. Now take a look at what is highlighted in green. Again, which dimension is mostly impacted or connected to this area in green? It says low family participation in school surveys and meetings further limits the school's ability to fully understand and address the unique needs of these students. Here I see answers coming in the chat. As you can see, some of these dimensions might not always be crisp clear. So for this, it's dimension 6. Notice that family engagement is not a specific category, but it is part of the dimension 6, which is positive and inviting school climate. A key question to further discuss may be, does each student attend school that actively and meaningfully engages in families? Okay, and the next one. Which dimension is mostly impacted or connected to this area highlighted in red? Place your answer in the chat. Okay. This is great because actually I do see a toggle between 7 and 5 and 7. And so dimension 5 is instructional time and attention, is the dimension that looks at high quality instructional time and teacher attention. Dimension 7, student supports and intervention. That one in the article, and which is also linked in one of the slides that I shared earlier, that one is tied closely to social, emotional, and mental support needs. So those 5 and 7 definitely go together. So if you think about this, the key question would be, does each student who need more high quality instructional time, do they receive it? So putting it all together, here are all the highlighted dimensions. As you can see, that these parts are interconnected within the context of the school. I want to remind you that you bring a wealth of context, background information, and individual stories from each student, teacher, and families for your school or for your district. Identifying the dimensions and then addressing the resource inequities is not a mystery. You are already likely engaging in this process at your school. The key question is how to systemize this approach across your LEA and your school, ensuring that it's not solely the leadership addressing these issues, but it's also about empowering your entire team and school community. So after finding the dimensions, is now engaging in the discussion to gain deeper understanding, then to determine the resource inequities. And to help you do this, we took that article that I shared with you earlier, the 10 Dimensions of Educational Resource Equity, and made it into a handout that could be easily accessible, summarized for your team. And the link to the handout is on this slide. And so as your team dives deeper in to this discussions, resource inequity, this is going to serve as a valuable tool. It poses key questions that help your district and schools conduct self-assessment to identify specific dimensions of resource equity. It's crucial that your team responses are grounded in the specific context of your school, and each answer should be followed by this question: how do you know? To foster a meaningful examination of resource inequities and their root causes. This reflective process is essential for effectively addressing and resolving these issues. And finally, as you guide your school site council, going back to school site council, and your educational partners, it's essential that this process leads to evidence-based interventions that effectively address the identified resource inequities. A comprehensive needs assessment should focus on deeply understanding the data, what it reveals, and what it may not fully capture. The SSC will analyze key data points to pinpoint performance gaps and disparities to access critical resources such as books, technology, and tutoring. Input from students, staff, and families will offer valuable perspectives on how these gaps impact student achievement and enable the SSC and the ED partners to prioritize resource needs and collectively develop a targeted solutions to address resource inequities. And later, Anita will provide further insights on evidence-based interventions in her upcoming presentation. And to close out, as a school and LEA leader, consider the following reflection questions. How do the dimensions of resource equity compare to the school or the LEA experiences and beliefs about what it takes to achieve equity of outcomes? How can these dimensions be incorporated into school planning and the comprehensive needs assessment? How can resource inequities be addressed in district and or school decision-making processes? and what next steps would advance a productive and fact-based discussion of resource equity in our system. And remember that identifying resource inequities is about more than just tracking resources. It's about recognizing disparities in student outcomes and addressing where the gaps exist so that every student has the potential to succeed. When we identify disparities, we uncover where inequities in access may be holding our students back. These inequities aren't simply about giving everyone the same thing, but about ensuring that those who need more support actually receive it, allowing them to thrive and not fall behind. True equity means providing tailored resources to lift up those who face greater challenges. And ultimately, every school's mission is to prepare every child for tomorrow, regardless of their circumstances, their parents' level of participation, or background. Ed partners, district leaders, school boards, advocates, families, educators must work together to foster meaningful conversations, understand the students' needs to mobilize resources effectively. And by doing so, we can empower every child for tomorrow, regardless of their circumstances or background. So thank you so much. And now we will take a 5-minute break and Anita will.
Welcome back, everyone. All right. Well, I hope you had an opportunity to at least stretch and maybe even walk a little bit around the office. Let's continue with the presentation by delving into evidence-based interventions. For just a brief moment, let's recap our learning up to this point in order to re-ground ourselves in this process. Beginning with the first square in the upper left side of this slide, we reviewed the composition of the school site council, their role and responsibilities back last week in day 1. Today, Adrienne reviewed the school plan requirements. Rachel reviewed how to conduct a comprehensive needs assessment that leads to root cause analysis, and Helen provided insight on how to identify resource inequities. And now moving along this graphic, we're ready to research, identify, and select evidence-based interventions that will support the needs of our students and support equity in outcomes. The cycle will continue with the implementation of the selected interventions, monitoring their progress, and examining and reflecting on their results, all documented within the school plan for student achievement. Now, what defines an evidence-based intervention? Let's begin with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that has consistently directed educators to implement interventions grounded in research. Almost 9 years ago, under No Child Left Behind, districts and schools were called to use scientifically based research as the foundation for education programs and interventions. But with the bipartisan reauthorization of this act in 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act replaced scientifically based research with evidence-based interventions. And this shift was designed to help increase the impact of educational investments by ensuring that interventions being implemented have proven to be effective in leading to desired outcomes, namely improving student achievement. Now, under the Every Student Succeeds Act, an evidence-based intervention is defined as an approach that has evidence to show that it has proven to be effective as possible at leading to desired outcomes, specifically increasing student achievement when implemented with fidelity. The evidence-based intervention selected for the students in your school or your LEA may be a strategy, a practice, a program, or a policy implemented or systematized at your site. Now, when selecting an evidence-based intervention for your identified problem of practice or area of improvement, please keep in mind that it must have a proven track record through studies and findings that demonstrates the following key components: that it has evidence to show it is effective in leading to improved outcomes for student achievement. Now, under ESSA, evidence-based interventions are further categorized within tiers of evidence, and there are 4 possible tiers. And in each of these tiers, the evidence has been produced through formal studies and research, but depending on the type of study and the level of evidence produced, the tiers are distinguished as such. Tier 1, strong evidence. Tier 2, moderate evidence. Tier 3, promising evidence. And Tier 4 demonstrates a rationale. The ESSA tiers of evidence provide districts and schools with a framework for determining which programs, practices, strategies, and interventions work, in which context, and for which students. Any federal funds included in your school plan must be expended on evidence-based interventions from tiers 1, 2, 3, or 4. Schools identified in ATSI or TSI may implement interventions from tiers 1, 2, 3, or 4 as well. If, however, your school is identified in CSI, ESSA requires that the interventions implemented have strong, moderate, or promising evidence. In other words, for CSI schools, interventions implemented must be from tiers 1, 2, or 3. Now, later in this presentation, Laurel will provide in-depth information related to CSI, ATSI, and TSI. Now, determining tiers of evidence for evidence-based interventions is based on 5 factors. The 5 factors include the study design, the results of the study, findings from related studies, sample size and setting, and lastly, its match, or how the students and the setting in the study match up with those in your district or your school. The use of the 5 factors allows for the systematic study of interventions, and it is what determines in which tier of evidence an intervention will be categorized. Now, one can certainly go down a rabbit hole trying to understand what components go into determining the tier of an evidence-based intervention. And in the next slide, we have a chart with the 4 tiers of evidence defined by the 5 factors that determine an intervention's evidence rating for your information. As you can see, there are notable differences in the study design row amongst the 4 tiers. The more controlled the experiment in the research study of an intervention, along with the effect size or significant positive effect on the outcome, increases the strength of the evidence and thus determines its tier. Now, luckily, I don't know if it's because it's the week of the administrator, but schools and LEAs are not expected to conduct a study of interventions and determine their evidence rating. LEAs in schools are, on the other hand, specifically tasked with selecting and implementing an intervention, such as a practice, activity, program, or policy that has already been identified as evidence-based and will address their students' needs and improve outcomes. This certainly makes sense since our students are only with us for a finite amount of time, and we want to ensure that the interventions we implement are vetted to secure the greatest possible effect possible for them, impacting their future. And as someone once said, time is of the essence. And so right about now, you may be wondering, how can you engage your educational partners and your school site council in selecting evidence-based interventions that address your student needs and provide resource equity, and where you can find them? There is guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that recommends a step-by-step process for choosing and implementing evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions that improve outcomes for students. Now, using the document titled Evidence to Strengthen Education Investments is a helpful 17-page non-regulatory guidance provided by the Department of Education that is included on this slide. You'll see the link at the bottom. It was most recently revised in September of 2023, and it offers you that step-by-step process. It is helpful to note that this guidance refers to evidence-based activities, strategies, and interventions collectively as project components. And this document also contains links to resources created and maintained by other public and private organizations. Now, there are 2 parts to this guidance. Part 1 reviews the 5 steps necessary for effective decision-making about evidence to use to address improved outcomes. Both Rachel and Helen covered step 1 earlier in the presentation with the comprehensive needs assessment, the root cause analysis, and resource inequity determinations. But then in step 2 of this document, highlighted here with a yellow star on the slide, the green dot, this guidance offers key considerations when selecting the relevant evidence-based project components. So let's hear that summary. We all know that one size does not work or fit in all schools. Needs, students, setting, community, etc., they're all different. And thus, these same factors play an important role when it comes to selecting your evidence-based project components that you'll implement. And so here are 3 considerations. 1, exploration of evidence. Schools should review the broadest range of evidence to ensure that project components selected are addressing the area of need and the relevant resource equity dimension. 2, relevance and rigor. It's important to select program components that are supported by strong evidence relevant to the learner population and context, especially in settings and populations similar to those being served at your site. And 3rd, organizational capacity. Before adopting any project component, schools need to address whether they have the necessary resources, including sufficient funding, staff willing to implement the project components as planned, personnel with the necessary skills and expertise, and support systems to successfully implement it. So let's begin with the first consideration, exploration of evidence. On this slide, you will find 8 resources with corresponding links where you can find lists of evidence-based interventions and detailed information. We are hopeful that these links will save you time, point you in the right direction, and support your efforts in finding the most effective interventions for your student needs. Next, let's take an in-depth look at one of the resources listed on the previous slide, which is the What Works Clearinghouse. You may have heard about this one before. It was established in 2002. The What Works Clearinghouse is an investment of the Institute of Educational Studies within the U.S. Department of Education. The WWC reviews evidence of effectiveness of programs, policies, and practices throughout education. And to begin, when you click on the link, the WWC will ask you to enter a word such as ELA or math. Next, you will select a topic of choice from a drop-down menu. And lastly, you will enter a grade band, also from a drop-down menu. Once you click on the search button, which is green here noted by the red arrow, you'll be ready to explore. The second consideration is selecting an evidence-based intervention which is relevant to your school context and the rigor of the evidence. So now that you've clicked on the search button on the WWC website, you will be able to see all the search results and be able to not only see the evidence tier for each of the interventions available, but you will also be able to further filter the choices by publication date, topics, populations, product type, grade level, evidence tier, and your school's type of community. You can also look up specific interventions by name, such as Accelerated Reader or Read Naturally, and be sure to click on the option that includes studies that don't meet standards. You may find that interventions currently underway at your site may or may not have sufficient evidence to fall into an evidence tier. In addition, once you select the intervention, your click will take you to a review of the intervention with details such as when it was reviewed, the design, the ratings, the findings, characteristics of the study sample, and details about the study, helping you determine if the intervention is a good match for your students at your school. The WWC also makes available practice guides with recommendations for your site, as well as other resources for educators where they can access videos webinars, and other helpful materials with guidance on evidence-based practices. The third key consideration when selecting an evidence-based intervention is organizational capacity. In order to ensure that an evidence-based intervention will be implemented effectively, schools should consider whether they have the resources needed. And these resources include enough funding, available staff, skilled staff and support for sustaining the intervention, as well as any implementation partners, such as an outside organization. And here are some questions to ponder before adding an intervention or an action into your SIPSA. Is there enough funding to support the intervention's implementation? Is there enough staff willing to support the implementation of the evidence-based intervention? Is there enough staff who are skilled or who can build capacity to implement the intervention with proficiency and fidelity? Is the intervention in line with LEA goals? Does it fit with your community values? Will your community support it? And if the intervention or program will be implemented by an outside organization, does that company or organization have expertise in using evidence-based strategies as required by ESSA? As you can see, selecting evidence-based interventions for your school plan needs to be comprehensive. And from the ESSA requirement that all interventions, practices, strategies, or programs fall within a tier of evidence to the 3 key recommendations for their selection, you can ensure that your plan will be developed to include actions that target the needs of students and will be implemented with fidelity. Once your school plan is developed with the evidence-based interventions, it is through the intentional implementation of the interventions and their continuous and sustained progress monitoring that a school plan for student achievement will provide reliability in accomplishing your goals. As you study the results throughout the school year at predetermined intervals, you will have an opportunity to examine the results thus far, reflect on those results, and determine any adjustments needed in your school plan for student achievement. And next, we go to wrap up kind of with some steps to developing the SIPSA. We've gone over a whole lot of information up to this point, I know. And if you find that in the midst of doing this important work or guiding your site administrators through this process, you need some additional information or clarity, please feel free to reach out to us. We are here to support you. And so next, we will synthesize and review the process of developing the school plan for student achievement in 7 doable steps. The SIPSA involves a continuous development, implementation, and monitoring cycle. And this graphic here offers a 7-step process in developing and annually reviewing your school plan. The process a school puts into motion alongside its school site council, staff, ELAC if required, develops an effective school plan that advances student achievement and improves academic outcomes. The 7 steps are as follows. 1. Analyze student achievement data with your educational partners. 2. Measure the effectiveness of current strategies. 3. Identify goals and key improvement areas. 4. Define timelines, personnel, and expenditures. 5. Recommend the SIPSA to the local governing board or body. 6. Implement the school plan for student achievement. And lastly, 7. Monitor the implementation. So let's go to step 1, analyze student achievement data. As Rachel mentioned earlier, the SIPSA must be based on an analysis of verifiable state data, consistent with all state priorities and informed by all indicators, which includes data such as your CAS or SBAC results in ELA, math, and science, LPAC results for English learners and long-term English learners, chronic absenteeism and attendance rates, suspension rates, graduation rates, as well as local benchmark assessments and other formative assessments. It is a best practice to identify the assessments that will be analyzed and present the data from various viewpoints, such as from the all-student group or disaggregated by student groups to ensure that the data is analyzed with an equity lens. Next, step 2, measure the effectiveness of current strategies. Schools conduct their needs assessment on the effectiveness of the school instructional program with the input from educational partners. Your data can be collected using site, district, or CDE developed tools and may include surveys, interviews, focus groups, observations, or review of records and/or documents. Your school site council should consider the relationship between the current instructional program as informed by your data collection tools. An accurate assessment and a thoughtful analysis of the current instructional program is essential to raising academic performance. And also in this step, remember that the SIPSA must be developed with the review, advisement, and certification of applicable school advisory committees, such as the ELAC if required. The advisory committees may wish to present their recommendations to the school site council in writing to facilitate communication. Advisory committee recommendations should be reflected in your school site council meeting minutes. And the last part of this process enables the school site council to determine areas of need and components of the instructional program that continue to be effective. Once the effectiveness of current strategies have been measured and analyzed, determine whether these will continue to be adopted, adapted, or abandoned. Step 3, identify your goals and key improvements. The LEA's LCAP identifies goals from all applicable state priorities and articulates the LEA's expectations, metrics, and actions. School-level strategies must be aligned with the LEA's LCAP actions, and this helps to ensure that both the LEA and the school sites are working in tandem. Once goals are established by the school site, determine which improvement strategies and related expenditures will be implemented and monitored. To be most effective, ensure that goals and improvement strategies are SMART. That is, that they're specific to the areas of need, that they're measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. Step 4 involves defining timelines, personnel, proposed expenditures, and funding sources. For each goal identified in the SIPSA, the school site council must specify the actions to be taken to accomplish the goal, dates by which the actions are to be started and completed, the persons responsible, expenditures needed to implement the action, and each funding source budgeted for the goal. Please keep in mind that expenditures, whether they are paying for personnel, materials, or services, are allowable if they are an effective means of accomplishing the purpose of the program, they are reasonable and necessary, they supplement and not supplant the general program. This means that they cannot pay for services that are required by state law or services provided to ineligible students. Ensure that all expenditures paid for with Title I funds are included in the SIPSA. Step 5 is the recommendation of the school plan to the local governing board or governing body. After advisory committees such as the ELAC, if applicable, have reviewed the proposed SIPSA, the school site council must approve the proposed SIPSA at a meeting for which public notice has been posted. By signing the SIPSA, the school site council is attesting to the following assurances: that the school site council was properly constituted, has reviewed its legal responsibilities, has sought input from the required advisory committees, has reviewed the content requirements for all programs included in the SIPSA, that the plan was based on an analysis of current practices and student academic performance, and lastly, that the plan was formally approved by the school site council before recommending it to the local governing board or body for approval. If the local governing board does not approve the plan, They must communicate this determination to the school site council with the specific reasons why and ask the school site council to revise and resubmit for approval. Now, please keep in mind that the activities and expenditures in the SIPSA are not authorized for implementation until the SIPSA is approved by the governing board or body. Step 6, implementing the SIPSA. Once the SIPSA has been board approved, the district and site administrators are responsible for implementing and evaluating the activities in the SIPSA. Implementation of the plan includes assigning, directing, and supervising project staff, purchasing materials and equipment, and accounting for the funds. The school and district administration may also support the planning process by providing training and information to the school site council and applicable advisory groups, or by developing proposals for the school site council's consideration. And now, step 7. Monitoring the implementation of the plan. Once the plan is approved and implemented, the school site council is responsible for monitoring the effectiveness of planned activities and modifying those that prove ineffective. Monitoring is more effective and efficient if the plan specifies actions, dates, estimated cost, and measurable anticipated student outcomes, as well as the persons involved in their responsibilities. A plan that is too general can minimize accountability and diminish results for student achievement. As the implementation of planned activities unfolds, the school site council should verify the success of each major event for identified students and share this information with advisory committees and other interested parties. There are times when mid-year changes to the SIPSA may be necessary, and that's okay. The school site council may decide to amend their SIPSA if, for example, a major service or activity is ineffective. Material changes occur that impact the academic programs. They are unable to secure staff, equipment, or materials to carry out the activity. School boundaries or demographics have changed, or an activity is not compliant or supported by the school community. The school site council may amend the plan at any time, but any revisions that would substantially change the academic programs funded through the CONAP must be reviewed and approved by the local governing board. And finally, as a resource, especially for high schools, CDE and the Accrediting Commissions for Schools, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, WASC, have worked to create an alignment with the accreditation cycle and the SIPSA, and the link is provided on this slide. These plans are closely aligned to the goals, actions, and services detailed in the LCAP. For high schools, consider how closely these plans and the processes are related and how you can leverage this to bring your team together to support each other through the development of the two plans. Thank you for your attention. And next up is Laurel Estrada.
Thanks, Anita. Now let's take a closer look at schools that have been identified for CSI, ATSI, or TSI, and how this identification impacts the SIPSA. If a school has been identified for CSI, ATSI, or TSI, LEAs and schools must work with educational partners to locally develop and implement a plan to improve student outcomes. Luckily, EdCode allows the SIPSA to fulfill the school improvement requirements needed in these plans. As Rachel shared earlier, CDE has posted SIPSA templates that are designed to meet school-wide program requirements for both the SIPSA and federal CSI, ATSI, and TSI planning requirements. That link is provided in this slide. We have also provided an explanation of the acronyms here. For schools identified for CSI, the site CSI plan must be based on a school level needs assessment and informed by all state indicators. It must also include evidence-based interventions and identify resource inequities. The LEA must describe in the LCAP how they supported the CSI school in developing the school level needs assessment, selecting evidence-based interventions, identifying resource inequities, and include a description of how it will monitor and evaluate the implementation and effectiveness of the site's CSI plan. It is not required for the LEA to include a description of the ATSI or TSI schools in the LCAP. For schools identified as ATSI, the school improvement plan must be based on indicators in the statewide accountability system and informed by all indicators, including student performance against long-term goals, evidence-based interventions, and identification of resource inequities. For schools identified as TSI, the plan has the same requirements as ATSI, with the exception of evaluation of resource inequities, which is not required. CSI and ATSI determinations are made on a 3-year cycle beginning with the 2023 dashboard. Due to the interruption in the state's accountability system, CSI and ATSI determinations were made in both 2022 and 2023. Moving forward, the state's ESSA plan includes determinations every 3 years. Therefore, the next CSI and ATSI determinations will be made based on the results of the 2026 dashboard. Schools that have not exited CSI or ATSI based on the 2024 dashboard will not be in the pool from which TSI schools are identified. Schools are not identified for more than one determination at a time. For example, a school in CSI cannot also be in ATSI. A school in ATSI cannot also be in TSI. Even in cases where a school continues to be identified for ATSI based on the 2024 dashboard, and an additional student group or groups would otherwise qualify for TSI based on the 2023 and 2024 dashboard, the school will continue with the ATSI determination. This slide provides the student groups that are used for both TSI and ATSI determination. LTELs are not among the student groups because they are not yet included in the ESSA state plan. In the upcoming slides, we will give some information regarding TSI, since it is new this year. Let's go over exactly what TSI is. TSI is an ESSA designation given to schools in need of targeted assistance based on performance outcomes of one or more student group. 2024-25 is the first year that California will determine school eligibility for TSI. Schools can only be eligible for one support category at a time. Therefore, a school eligible for TSI cannot also be eligible for ATSI or CSI at the same time. As shown in the previous graphic, during the CSI, ATSI non-entry years, TSI determinations are made. Per California's ESSA state plan, TSI requires one or more student group or groups that for 2 consecutive years, based on the California School Dashboard, meet the same criteria that were used to determine CSI low-performing schools. ESSA school improvement funding is not available for TSI. This chart shows the criteria used to determine whether a student group qualifies for TSI. Remember that qualification in 2024 is based on performance across 2 years. The criteria did not change from 23 to 24. As a reminder, the criteria for schools to qualify for CSI are the same criteria that are applied to student groups that qualify for ATSI or TSI. So how will schools know if they're designated for TSI? The 2024-25 ESSA Assistance Status Data File will indicate the student group or groups that meet the TSI criteria. It is linked to this slide for your convenience. It's anticipated that this data file will be published on the CDE webpage with updates from the 2024 dashboard in early 2025. This file includes information from 2018 to present, identification for TSI based on the 2023 and 2024 dashboard, and exit status from previous years for CSI or ATSI, which is, of course, something to celebrate. Each school receiving a TSI eligibility notification from its LEA in collaboration with educational partners shall develop and implement a school-level TSI plan to improve student outcomes based on indicators in the statewide accountability system for each group that was the subject of notification. As mentioned earlier, there's a template available on the CDE web page to support this planning. TSI plans must be informed by all indicators, including student performance against long-term goals. They must include evidence-based interventions, strategies, and/or activities. So it will be important to remember to refer back to all those great resources that Anita shared earlier in this presentation. Finally, the plan must be approved by the LEA prior to implementation, so no later than the first day of the 2025-26 school year, and monitored throughout implementation. To visually represent the similarities and differences in CSI, ATSI, and TSI, this chart provides clarification using these subheadings: when, who, exit, notification, plan, and funding. Specific to TSI, eligibility is determined in non-CSI, ATSI years. There's a student group focus. Annual determination is used to exit, so no additional exit criteria are applied other than no longer meeting criteria for entry. LEAs must notify the eligible school or schools. Schools then develop the plan with educational partners. The plan does not include resource inequities, and no funding is available for TSI. A handout with this information is included for your reference. Once again, federal planning requirements established in Ed Code allow SIPSA to meet ESSA requirements for CSI, ATSI, and TSI planning. It also allows single school districts and charter schools to utilize the LCAP to serve as the SIPSA, so long as it meets ESSA planning and educational partner requirements. Or LEAs may choose to have separate plans or a combination of plans. This timeline expands on the timeline that Rachel shared in a previous slide and illustrates exactly how CSI, ATSI, and TSI requirements can fit into the SIPSA cycle. The timeline continues for CSI and ATSI schools based on last year's plan. Please note that this timeline includes planning activities for newly identified TSI schools in April and May. These are similar to planning activities that schools identified for CSI or ATSI completed last year, with the exception that identification of resource inequities is not required for TSI schools. As a reminder, a school would not have more than one designation at a time for CSI, ATSI, or TSI. The most important takeaway from this timeline is that the SIPSA is designed to fulfill all planning requirements for CSI, ATSI, and TSI. If your SIPSA development and monitoring process is strong, everything else will follow. Now let's hear from Adrian.
Thank you, Laurel. Well, as we finish up today's training, we'll take a brief look at the LCAP, the LCAP Federal Addendum, and the SIPSA, and see how they align with and impact the school plan to support equity of outcomes. So let's take a look at an overview of the three documents, the LCAP Federal Addendum, and the SIPSA. The LCAP addresses state priorities, goals, and includes actions and services. The LCAP Federal Addendum addresses the federal provisions for Title I, II, III, and Title IV. And as you have heard today, the school plan for student achievement outlines how supplemental Title I funds are used to close achievement gaps. Though not required, some LEAs will have a non-Title I school develop a SIPSA plan in order to close the achievement gaps at those non-Title I schools. It's important to understand the full purpose of these plans. The LCAP is an LEA or district level plan. The LCAP describes how the LEA is supporting all students as well as specific student groups in the 8 state priorities. It also describes how it will support equity of outcomes for the lowest performing student groups. And additionally, the LCAP demonstrates how the LEA is providing increased or improved services for the 3 targeted groups in proportion to the additional funds the LEA receives for students who are low income, English learners, and/or foster youth. The LCAP Federal Addendum is an LEA level document that describes how the LEA is meeting the federal program requirements by supplementing the LEA's program outlined in the LCAP. And as you've heard today, the School Plan for Student Achievement is a school level plan outlining how supplemental Title I funds are used to address the academic achievement gaps, particularly those students who are furthest from achieving the standards. We've provided a visual chart showing the requirements for each of these documents. It also outlines where each plan comes from, the timing for submission, the approving entity, the focus of the plan, and the locus of decision making. You will notice the addendum column is colored differently, and this is because the LCAP and the SIPSA are plans, but the LCAP Federal Addendum is a companion document addressing specific provisions that are required by every Student Succeeds Act. It is important that district and school site personnel and school site council members and advisory committee members are aware of what is being provided in the LCAP and what is described in the LCAP Federal Addendum so that the school level planning of the SIPSA can build upon these services. It is also important to note that per statute, the superintendent of the school district is required to review school plans to ensure actions in the LCAP are consistent with the strategies in the school plans. This requirement is embedded in the LCAP approval process requirement. The intent is for there to be a symbiotic process with information flowing back and forth between the school and the district level leadership. The needs assessment and annual evaluation processes from the school and the LEA should be aligned so that the decisions can best address both the site and district level needs. This reciprocal relationship can ensure that resources are most effectively leveraged, provide coordinated support, and also avoid duplication of effort. So, but what does this mean and how does this really happen? We often get that question. To answer this question of how does it really happen, CDE has provided some helpful resources that address the planning process for the SIPSA and the LCAP, and it is available at this link on the slide. Here, the CDE provides considerations for how planning for the LCAP and school plan can be aligned. The website explains how the design of the optional CDE SIPSA templates that were shared earlier intentionally mirrors the LCAP template, and it also uses common vocabulary and sections addressing continuous improvement. The intent is that each template is designed to reflect a planning process based on a continuous improvement model where educational partners engage in a needs assessment and analysis to determine the needs and to develop strategies to address those needs and to address any resource inequities. Each template includes outcome to support reflections of effectiveness of the implementation. In closing today, we offer some things to consider about the components in the planning process for the LCAP and the SIPSA, and how a continuous improvement process, such as what the team has outlined today and last week, can support the LEA, can support the school site councils and advisory committees in engaging in a process to identify and address school level and LEA-wide needs. It's an ongoing process, not just a year-end process. Aligning the LCAP and SIPSA planning timelines can allow for LEAs and school site councils to leverage and coordinate resources to address the needs at the school site and across the LEA. In this way, district staff and school site council leadership working on the LCAP are aware of the needs arising from the school. Then, if resource inequities are identified, LEA staff are aware of that and can determine with educational partners what should be addressed in the LCAP at the LEA-wide level or school-wide level at specific schools. And from that, then the SIPSA can build upon that. Additionally, LEA support in aligned processes can assist in determining if there are gaps in mandated services or basic services that are provided for all students that need to be addressed at the district level. The graphic on the screen identifies 3 LCAP phases in the annual LCAP continuous improvement cycle. These include LCAP implementation in the fall, goal analysis beginning in the winter, and plan development and adoption in the spring. And so how does your SIPSA continuous improvement cycle align to this timeline for the LCAP process? Your school or LEA may have practices in place that support aligned planning processes, but we want to leave you with some questions to reflect on. How does your school site council and your advisory committee members know about the LCAP process and what is in the LCAP? How does the school site council provide input about school level needs that inform the LCAP cycle? We want to thank you and appreciate you joining us this morning. We ask you to please take time to provide us with your feedback about today's presentation. Your responses are important to us and help us to reflect and guide our future planning to address your needs. We'll leave the chat open a few minutes for you to place any last-minute questions. And again, we want to thank you for joining us today and last week, and we want to wish you a happy day and a great day. And again, if you can put it back on the evaluation slide. Thank you.